Victory is finding leaders who stand by these principles. And do you agree with them every single time? No. But you agree with them far more than we will ever agree with the radical democratic left. Because democratic socialism is the thing that will destroy America. Radical Sharia is the thing that will destroy America. Stealing puberty from young people is the thing that will destroy America. And so what I choose to do now is I choose to build a movement and be a part of a movement that stands on principle, that stands on strength, that loves the people in the movement, even sometimes when they piss you off.
So Byron Donalds at America Fest just days ago stands on that stage with the absolute moral vacancy that defines this political moment and delivers what amounts to a calculated distillation of the authoritarian right's entire ideological apparatus. And you just watched him do it. You heard him say those words about democratic socialism and radical Sharia, and what he so repulsively terms stealing puberty from young people. And here's the thing that should make your blood absolutely boil, with the kind of righteous fury that animates every genuine movement for justice in human history. Because Donalds spoke at AmFest 2025, warning of the dangers of democratic socialism and Sharia law, and this wasn't some slip of the tongue or rhetorical accident. This was the mainstreaming of fascist discourse, dressed up in the language of principled conservatism, and we need to understand the catastrophic stakes of this moment, because what you're witnessing isn't just another MAGA politician saying outrageous things to fire up the base. What you're witnessing is the deliberate construction of an enemy so monstrous, so totalizing, so apocalyptic that any response becomes justified in advance. Listen to the structure of what he's saying, because MAGA ideology argues that America is on the brink of destruction, because it has strayed from foundational principles and frames the current political landscape as an existential battle for the nation's survival, and that framing does very specific rhetorical work. It evacuates the possibility of democratic contestation and replaces it with a civilizational deathmatch where your opponents aren't merely wrong about policy, they are actively destroying the country from within. And when Donalds names democratic socialism as one of those existential threats, he's not engaging with the actual political tradition that gave us the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the country's largest socialist organization, with more than 90,000 members as of November 2025, and includes elected officials like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani. He's conjuring a specter. He's deploying a term that polling shows more Democrats have held positive views of socialism than of capitalism since 2016, with the gap expanding to 24 points, occurring at a time when many high-profile Democratic officials have identified themselves as democratic socialists, precisely because those officials are advocating for the kinds of economic justice that should be baseline expectations in any wealthy democracy. Because here's what democratic socialism actually means in the contemporary American context, and this is crucial. The DSA's platform centers on policies like Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, robust labor protections and wealth redistribution through taxation, and they aim to achieve these goals through existing democratic processes, not revolution design. And when you look at the material reality of what these organizers and candidates are fighting for, you see more than 100 Democratic Socialist elected officials, staffers and organizers meeting in New Orleans for the How We Win conference, demonstrating American socialists' growing influence and confidence, and the issues they're centering are things like affordable housing and universal child care and living wages and worker power, the kinds of programs that would materially improve the lives of millions of people who have been absolutely brutalized by 40 years of neoliberal economic policy that transferred wealth upward while decimating unions and shredding the social safety net. But Donalds can't engage with that reality, because acknowledging it would require him to defend an economic system that now sees only 54% of Americans viewing capitalism positively, the lowest Gallup has measured, even as Americans retain generally positive views of free enterprise and small business, which tells you everything about how people understand the distinction between entrepreneurship and extractive corporate power. And then watch how seamlessly he pivots to radical Sharia, just drops it right there alongside democratic socialism, as if these are equivalent categories of threat. And this is where the Islamophobia that has been part of the Republican DNA for decades becomes nakedly visible, because between 2011 and 2015, the threat of creeping Sharia law became quite common in far-right circles, before eventually getting picked up by some Republicans eager to score points with the most rabid elements of the GOP base. With Newt Gingrich, even including anti-Sharia provisions in his 2012 presidential platform, this garbage rhetoric temporarily faded, and now the fact that this anti-Sharia nonsense is apparently back suggests that the GOP's existing list of boogeymen isn't delivering the kind of results the party wants to see. So Republicans are turning back the clock, pointing anew to an old threat that still does not exist. And we need to be absolutely clear about what's happening here. Because when politicians invoke Sharia law as this civilizational threat, they are engaging in what scholars identify as manufacturing otherness. They are taking a religious and ethical framework that simply means the path in Arabic, a moral and spiritual framework guiding prayer, charity, and ethical conduct, much like biblical principles for Christians or halakha for Jews, as personal guidance, not something imposed on others, and weaponizing it into a racialized bogeyman. Because the truth is, state-sanctioned Sharia law did not and does not exist in this country, and the idea that government officials would impose Sharia on the populace was obviously silly. But too many Republicans took this seriously, as part of a bizarre campaign to scare people and turn Muslim Americans into a threat in need of government action, and the material consequences of this rhetoric are devastating, because Muslim advocates say the rhetoric that follows these copycat anti-Sharia bills has done tangible harm to Muslim communities, with hate crimes targeting Muslims at their highest levels since immediately after 9/11, with at least 381 anti-Muslim offenses reported to law enforcement agencies in 2016. And this matters right now in December 2025, because 2 Republican lawmakers have introduced legislation seeking to ban the enforcement of Sharia law in the United States, called the No Sharia Act, announced by Florida Representative Randy Fine and Texas Representative Keith Self. And just last week, 2 Republicans in Congress are calling for the mass expulsion of Muslims from the United States following a mass shooting, amplifying an increasingly brazen Islamophobic sentiment within the party. This is happening right now. This is the context in which Donalds is speaking. And then he completes his trinity of apocalyptic threats with what he calls stealing puberty from young people. And this language is so calculatedly vicious, so deliberately designed to trigger moral panic, that we need to just stop and examine what he's actually talking about, because when he says stealing puberty, he means gender-affirming care for transgender youth, and the Trump administration has spent 2025 launching a comprehensive assault on this healthcare because a proposed rule prohibits doctors and hospitals from receiving federal Medicaid reimbursement for gender-affirming care provided to transgender patients younger than age 18, with Medicaid being the healthcare program that covers low-income Americans. A second rule blocks all Medicaid and Medicare funding for any services at hospitals that provide pediatric gender-affirming care, and taken together, the forthcoming hospital rules could make access to pediatric gender-affirming care across the country extremely difficult, if not impossible, with the care already banned in 27 states. So let's talk about what gender-affirming care actually is, because the discourse has been so polluted by bad faith actors that people genuinely don't understand. We're talking about a supportive form of healthcare consisting of an array of services that may include medical, surgical, mental health, and non-medical services for transgender and non-binary people, and the research consistently shows that gender-affirming medical care has positive mental health impact for transgender adolescents and young adults, with a survey of more than 20,000 transgender adults finding significantly lower odds of lifetime suicidal ideation in those treated with pubertal blockers during adolescence compared to those who wanted such treatment but did not receive it. And crucially, use of puberty-delaying medication or hormone therapy remains rare and reflects a cautious approach, with fewer than 1 in 1,000 U.S. adolescents with commercial insurance receiving either treatment during the 5-year period from 2018 to 2022, and guidelines recommend against prescribing any medication for gender dysphoria before puberty starts. So the idea that there's some epidemic of children being rushed into irreversible procedures is a complete fabrication. But Donalds doesn't want you to know that, because there is wide consensus in the healthcare community that gender-affirming care can improve the health of transgender youth, including by lowering incidents of suicide, anxiety, self-harm, and depression. State legislatures, governors, and administrative agencies are taking steps to eliminate access to medically necessary, age-appropriate, and safe healthcare, backed by decades of research and supported by every major medical association, together representing over 1.3 million U.S. doctors. This is what he's characterizing as stealing puberty. He's talking about evidence-based medical care that in 7 reported instances had bans that led to suicide attempts among transgender youth, experiencing increased anxiety and depression, And the human cost of this rhetoric is being documented in real time, as 25 states have enacted blanket bans on gender-affirming care for transgender youth as of March 2025, disrupting healthcare access for over 100,000 transgender youth and imposing significant geographic, financial, and emotional burdens on their families. Now here's where it gets truly sinister, because notice how Donalds frames his concluding call to action. He says he chooses to build a movement that stands on principle, that stands on strength, that loves the people in the movement even sometimes when they piss you off. And this is the language of authoritarian solidarity. This is ideology that frames politics as a struggle over right values and lifestyles, which heightens the risk of malignant moral superiority, and when communicated by a leader, creates in followers the sense that they have an obligation to act against evil forces which threaten their group. And research on the MAGA movement specifically shows that supporters are far more likely to believe that violence in order to advance the movement's political objectives would be justified, and that there will be a civil war in the U.S. This is the formation of what political scientists would identify as an in-group defined entirely by its opposition to demonized out-groups, and the almost absolute faith in Trump's leadership has a lot to do with negative resentment of groups he singles out for criticism, particularly migrants, liberals, and feminists, but it is actually a positive identification with white nationalism that is a stronger indicator of who might identify with MAGA. And that's the architecture of fascism. That's the structure of how democracies collapse. You create categories of people who are framed as such dire threats to the nation's existence that normal democratic guardrails become obstacles to survival rather than protections of liberty. And you can trace a direct line from this rhetoric to concern about how deeply the MAGA movement has normalized what was once considered fringe behavior with open calls for political violence previously relegated to militia groups or online trolls, now appearing regularly in the rhetoric of elected officials, state party platforms, and viral content, and the result is a cultural fracture so deep that it renders reconciliation nearly impossible, replacing shared human values with the politics of permanent warfare that are emotional, existential, and unrelenting. Because what Donalds is doing at that Turning Point USA conference, and what the entire MAGA apparatus has been doing with increasing brazenness, is collapsing the distinction between political disagreement and civilizational warfare. And when you tell people that democratic socialists, who want universal health care, are equivalent threats to radical religious extremism, and that providing medical care to transgender kids is tantamount to child abuse, when you construct that kind of moral universe, you are preparing the ground for atrocity. You are giving people permission to view their fellow citizens, not as people with different policy preferences, but as enemies who must be defeated by any means necessary. This is how Trump's 2025 national security strategy casts the U.S. primarily as a victim exploited by its allies, and shackled by hostile institutions where exceptionalism becomes the story of a besieged superpower rather than a model of democracy, and that victimhood narrative is essential because it allows the most powerful country in the history of the world to claim it's under existential threat from teachers and librarians, and trans kids and Muslim Americans, and people who think healthcare should be free at the point of service. And we need to reckon with the fact that this isn't just rhetoric without consequences. This has policy implications that are already devastating real people's lives, because while Donalds talks about principles and strength and building movements, the MAGA agenda includes $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid alone, as well as steep reductions in spending for health coverage under the Affordable Care Act, and critical income support such as SNAP, with MAGA defenders having trouble squaring this with simultaneous extensions of historic giveaways to the highest earners, and claiming that Medicaid work requirements will spur Americans to achieve great individual success, even though the vast majority of Medicaid recipients already work. So the same people telling you that democratic socialism will destroy America are actively working to dismantle the programs that keep working-class people alive. They're taking healthcare away from poor children while giving tax cuts to billionaires, and then wrapping it all in the language of defending Western civilization. The most monumental lie that Donalds is selling is that there's some equivalence between the supposed threats he's naming, when in reality democratic socialists in America are running on platforms of expanding healthcare access and building affordable housing and investing in green infrastructure. They're winning elections because at least 6 in 10 across every major demographic group agreed that corporations and the wealthy have too much influence in the party they usually vote for, and majorities blamed landlord and bank profiteering for the housing crisis, pointing to a concrete program of raising wages, lowering prices, stopping price gouging, punishing corruption, and protecting workers' rights. And the reason that message resonates is because it addresses the material conditions of people's actual lives rather than conjuring phantom threats. Meanwhile, the supposed danger of radical Sharia, exists nowhere except in the fevered imaginations of right-wing activists who need a racialized other to justify their politics of exclusion, and gender-affirming care for youth is evidence-based medicine that saves lives. But here's what should terrify you. Here's what should mobilize you to action, because we are currently witnessing activity from groups whose intention is to fracture the baseline of support that underpins movements, including introducing pressure narratives in what is reasonably called a narrative operation. And the goal is to create such profound social division that the possibility of collective democratic action becomes impossible to imagine. When Donalds stands on that stage and names these three things as equivalent civilizational threats, he's not making an argument. He's performing a ritual of exclusion. He's telling his audience who belongs in the American project and who doesn't. And the people who don't belong are socialists, who want economic democracy, Muslims who practice their faith, and transgender young people who need healthcare to survive. This is eliminationist rhetoric, dressed up as principled conservatism, and the catastrophic irony is that MAGA rhetoric invokes a mythologized past that existed before immigration, feminism, or racial reckoning changed the social landscape, where Trump is less a man than a time machine, a portal back to a country where white, Christian, heterosexual men held uncontested authority, and that vision requires the active suppression of everyone who doesn't fit that template. So when he talks about building a movement based on love for the people in it, what he means is conditional belonging predicated on ideological conformity and demographic acceptability. What he means is a politics of permanent hierarchy where some people matter and others are expendable. And the fight we're in right now, the fight that will define the next decade of American political life, is whether we're going to allow that vision to prevail, or whether we're going to insist on a genuinely pluralistic democracy where people can advocate for economic redistribution without being called destroyers of America, where Muslims can practice their faith without being portrayed as civilizational threats, where trans kids can access healthcare without politicians calling it child abuse. Because the alternative to Donald's apocalyptic vision isn't the destruction of America, it's the creation of a country where healthcare is a right, and housing is affordable, and workers have power and people can be who they are without fear, and that future is possible. It's being built right now by the organizers and activists and elected officials who refuse to accept artificial scarcity and manufactured division as the natural order of things. What you just watched in that clip is a member of Congress standing in front of a crowd of young conservatives and telling them that their political opponents aren't merely wrong, but actively destroying the nation. And he's doing it with the confidence of someone who knows the audience will eat it up, who knows that in the current information ecosystem, you can say absolutely anything, as long as it confirms the tribal narrative, and the fact that Donalds leads in Florida governor polls with 38% support among likely GOP voters tells you this isn't fringe politics anymore, this is mainstream Republican doctrine. So the question becomes, what do we do with that information? How do we respond to a political movement that has given up on democratic contestation in favor of civilizational warfare? And the answer can't be to retreat into despair or cynicism, because that's exactly what they want. They want you exhausted and demoralized and convinced that nothing matters. The answer has to be building the alternative. It has to be showing in material ways that democratic socialism means better lives for working people, that religious pluralism makes us stronger, not weaker, that trans kids deserve love and support and healthcare just like any other kids. And that requires organizing and mobilizing and winning elections and changing policy, and never ever accepting the premise that some human beings are threats to be neutralized rather than people with legitimate claims to dignity and resources. Because that's what's at stake in this moment. Not some abstract principle, but the actual physical survival and flourishing of millions of people who are being targeted by this rhetoric. And if you care about justice, if you believe in democracy, if you think a better world is possible, then you have to commit to fighting for it with everything you have, because the people on the other side are absolutely committed to taking it away.